Designing products that actually work at the best of times is really difficult. Designing vehicles, especially ships with so many complex moving parts, is extremely difficult. It's really honestly amazing that through human history we've been able to design and build so many successful ships at all. But occasionally designers don't quite get it right. There's a whole mix of things that can go wrong, anything from incorrect following of procedure during construction or bad mathematics during the design process itself. On this channel, we've covered a lot of ship design failures, and these are some of my favorite videos we've ever done. So today, let's rewind the clock, sit back, and enjoy truly some of the most egregious design failures that we've ever covered on the channel. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and these are some of the worst ship design failures from history. This first one is actually very contentious. See, I said before that sometimes a ship's failure in design can come down to just one simple mistake. Last time we looked at how the Hunt-class destroyers were almost an absolute dismal failure because somebody got their math wrong. But long before those destroyer escorts were dreamt up, the Royal Navy was experimenting with a new class of warship that was designed to combine the speed and agility of a cruiser and the armament and power of a battleship. And the combination would result in an interesting new class of warship that met both success and terrible catastrophe, and it would cast doubt over the entire concept that endures to this day. Battleships and cruisers are classes of warship that are very different to one another, and the distinction was even more evident in the years before the First World War. See, back then, battleships were these large, fairly slow, heavy hitters like prize fighters of the Navy designed for absolute dominance in a fleet action. In the early 1900s, the navies of the world were experimenting with fitting as many guns as they could to these powerful ships, with some pretty mixed results. The Royal Navy changed the game in 1906 with the world-famous HMS Dreadnought, a battleship that was very quick for her day at 21 knots, but more crucially, the ship had a uniform main battery. She was designed so that large turrets could field guns of 12 inches, or 305mm, in such a way that powerful broadsides could be brought to bear, or if the ship was facing stem on to the enemy, that is directly in front or behind, then at least 6 main guns could be put on target. Now this changed the idea of what a battleship was, and soon the world's navies were rushing to build their own dreadnoughts. And in a fierce naval arms race with Germany, Great Britain's Admiralty rushed to rebuild their own navy and replace many of their aging, lumbering, awkward battleships with dreadnought-style warships instead. But meanwhile, there had actually also been a cruiser arms race brewing for years. The cruisers were not like battleships, they were smaller, leaner and faster, and therefore could mount only smaller caliber guns and torpedoes, but their benefit was obvious: supporting the battleships, outmaneuvering the enemy, and being a thorn in the enemy fleet's side. But against battleships, cruisers could only hope to pepper them with smaller caliber gunfire, maybe even start a fire on deck or land a torpedo hit. Before Dreadnought was constructed, British Admiral John "Jackie" Fisher had been toying with the idea of taking a cruiser and remedying its perceived inferiority to the battleship, commissioning designs for the most upgunned cruiser possible. And in the end, a design program ensured that one new battleship design would be built, HMS Dreadnought, but 3 new heavily armed and armoured cruisers would be built as well. Now these new cruisers were unlike any other that had been seen before. They were immense in size and carried the huge 12-inch guns that Dreadnought had. Their whole reason for being was to take the fight to the enemy, to run down slower, older warships and hit them hard with their powerful battleship-caliber guns. But to do it, the designers had to pull off a few engineering miracles. First, the new style of cruiser had to be extremely long. A longer hull form moves easily through the water and is very hydrodynamically efficient. Typically, the longer and leaner a ship is, the faster it will go. In fact, this new style of cruiser was about 40 feet or 12 meters longer than Dreadnought, but it was narrower. It means they could hit 25 knots. Now this was the same as the then world record-holding speedy passenger liner RMS Mauritania. It was very impressive. They also mounted 8 of the big 12-inch or 305mm guns that Dreadnought had. It was only 2 less than that battleship. But where they differed from battleships was in their armour layout. Now, this new class of cruiser was as big as a dreadnought, but it lacked the armor protection afforded to the heavier battleships. Now, the reasoning was actually to do mainly with cost and doctrine. The new cruisers were really designed for speedy, flanking operations to nip at the enemy, chase him into a place he doesn't want to be in, or to destroy weaker ships with their powerful main armament. But they were not designed to duke it out with battleships of the line. That was Dreadnought's job. So the latter was kitted out with up to 11 inches, or 28 centimeters of solid steel belt armor, the armor designed to protect the ship's hull and all the critical machinery and powder magazines inside. She also had 3 inches, or 7.6 centimeters, of deck armor. Now, by contrast, the cruisers got less than half that amount of belt armor, and only 2.5 inches, or 6.4 centimeters, of deck armor. Now, the deck armor was important too, because at ranges battleships engaged one another, the shells would be falling downwards thanks to gravity, and be likely to hit from above. Now, less armor meant that the new cruisers were a little bit lighter than the dreadnoughts, but more importantly, they were cheaper to produce. They didn't get heavy armor because it was thought in their normal operation that they just wouldn't need it. They were clearly not anything like the last generation of cruisers. This was something entirely different. But at first, their actual function obviously caused a little bit of confusion within the Admiralty. Early on, this style of ship was referred to as a cruiser battleship, and then a dreadnought cruiser. But by 1911, the designation had officially settled on battle cruiser, and a new class of warship was born. The first Royal Navy battlecruiser was given the somewhat ominous name HMS Invincible. Now, there's a lot of misinformation and mythology around the battlecruiser and its perceived failure as a class of ship. In many ways, it was actually evolutionary. It led to the largely successful fast battleships of the Second World War. But back in the First World War, the navies of Britain and Germany were excited to deploy their new battlecruiser squadrons, because of course, when Britain started making them, Germany did as well. In 1916, both nations finally got their chance at the infamous, sprawling battle known as Jutland. On May 31st, HMS Invincible herself steamed into action against the large German fleet as part of Vice Admiral David Beatty's dedicated battlecruiser squadron. Now, this was actually the first time the battlecruiser would partake in a proper fleet action against combined enemy warships, which included battleships. Before then, HMS Invincible and her type had seen great success in hunting down and destroying smaller and weaker warships like they were originally intended to. But this battle would be different. The battlecruisers were supposed to harass the German line, and at around 6:15 on the 31st, they engaged the Germans' equivalent battlecruiser force. The results for the British were not good. HMS Invincible was engaged by 2 German warships, and within just a minute and a half had taken 3 salvos of enemy fire, and then it happened. HMS Invincible did not live up to her name, and she detonated in a spectacular explosion that blew the ship clean in half and sent a great gout of smoke and flame high into the sky. All but 6 of her men were killed, but shockingly, this wasn't the first battlecruiser casualty of the day. Just beforehand, at 4 o'clock, 2 other battlecruisers had actually been lost. HMS Indefatigable, a new class of battlecruiser, had taken about 3 shell hits to her rear gun turret and began to sink when more shell hits blew her magazines and the ship went up, blown in half in a ball of flame. And then, at around about 4:30, the battlecruiser Queen Mary took a hit to her forward magazine and she went up as well. It prompted Beatty, the battlecruiser squadron's commander, to mutter those famous words, "There's something wrong with our bloody ships today." Now, there's actually a few key takeaways from this. First of all, in the battlecruiser's early careers, it had been shown that they were highly successful in chasing down and destroying smaller, older ships, but they were clearly not without serious flaws. In engaging the German battlecruisers, Invincible and her fleet mates were encountering battleship caliber shells in return, which hit hard and cut through their thin armor like it was paper. One theory goes that the British employed unsafe and lax handling procedures for their powder, which led to the detonations, but the German fleets actually employed similar practices. Interestingly, one German battlecruiser came very near to detonation at Jutland as well. SMS Seydlitz was hit with a 15-inch shell fired from the British HMS Lion, which slammed into her barbette, the massive cylindrical armour below the gun turret which protects the powder inside. Now, the shell didn't penetrate, but it shattered the inside of the barbette's armour, and a red-hot shard of metal ignited some of the powder that was there and started a fire, which killed many of the gun's crew. Now, with only seconds before the ship was going to go up, a German crewman heroically flooded the magazine with water and saved the ship from certain destruction. Now, the incident was a close shave for the Germans, but it highlighted one major design discrepancy between Seydlitz and the British battlecruiser's armour. See, Seydlitz had a barbette with 9 inches, or 23 centimetres of protection, whereas HMS Invincible had only 7 inches, or 17.8 centimetres. A clean hit on the British barbette was likely to penetrate and spark off a fire within the powder magazine, leading to the detonation of the ship. So, was the British battlecruiser a design failure? Well, the class of ship has attracted much criticism, but it has to be pointed out that for their original intended purpose, the warships proved more than adequate and extremely useful. As technology improved and battleships could be made faster, in the end the battlecruiser gave way to the fast battleships in the 1930s. But in World War II, a few still saw combat. HMS Hood famously suffered a similar magazine detonation when she was hit by the German battleship Bismarck, although that shot seems to have been an extremely lucky one that passed below the ship's belt armour under the waterline. We've actually covered this in a video before, and that kind of shot could have killed a more armoured battleship anyway. In the end, the British battlecruisers deserve a spot on the design failure list because when they were expected to support the main battleship fleet in larger fleet actions, they just couldn't hope to stand up to repeated hits from battleship caliber shells. Now, this was a failure more in doctrine, where the design just couldn't keep up. They were extremely useful as protection for merchant convoys against raiders, and they could hunt down and destroy older, smaller warships very easily, but when it came to taking on enemies firing anything as large as a 12 or 15-inch gun, they just didn't have the armour to protect their magazines. Now, you wonder if maybe they'd been built with the German style of more heavily protected barbette, Invincible, Indefatigable, and Queen Mary might have survived. Now, this next one was actually suggested by a viewer of the channel named Chris. Ocean liners are designed to get people from point A to point B as quickly as possible over very large distances, and I've often referred to them as big, luxurious ferries. But the humble ferry shouldn't be underestimated in any way, because these ships also battle through some of the harshest seas in the world, but their development and use has not been without serious incidents, and it's all down to one fundamental Achilles heel. Early ferries took people to nearby locations across water and would winch and manhandle critical cargo on board with cranes or booms. But by the 20th century, cars had taken over as the main form of transport for people over distances on land, and ferries had to be updated to keep with the times. Most passengers had their own cars, and so taking hours to winch individual passenger cars on board, one by one, just wouldn't do. A simpler, faster solution would be needed. Now, this birthed the so-called roll-on, roll-off ferry, or ro-ro for short, where passengers could just drive right on up and into the ship themselves. Now, you're probably familiar with this type of ship because they're very much in use today, but in the 1940s it was a revolutionary new development, and roll-on, roll-off ships were built to operate on short routes across the world. Now, the ability for passengers to drive up and straight into the ship required some design quirks, to say the least. In order to actually get passenger cars on board, a fairly sizable hole would be needed for them to drive through. Now, doors had to be fitted to the ferry's loading bay to keep the ocean out and to keep the hull watertight. Early ro-ro ferries featured doors at their stern on the back of the ship, and right off the bat, having a massive hole in your ship's hull that can cause massive and unchecked flooding is an obvious red flag, and the vessel's safety will come down to the integrity and strength of the doors actually fitted to protect the hull. Now, in a normal ship, watertight compartments would be able to be sealed shut and prevent water from flooding through to the rest of the vessel, but early ro-ro ferries also needed to keep their lower decks clear and open so that cars could actually be driven in and parked. They didn't have watertight compartments on the car decks. Now, this is also a massive red flag as far as ship design goes, but so long as those doors held up, then there shouldn't have been an issue. Well, this was all put to the test, a few times actually, but first, in January 1953, when the early ro-ro ferry Princess Victoria was battling her way through a nasty sea between Stranraer in Scotland and Larne in Northern Ireland. With a gale warning in effect, the ferry put to sea with 179 passengers and crew on board, but it was noted soon after that waves and spray were breaking over the ship's stern and hammering in the doors. Now, this should not necessarily have been a problem. The designers had fitted sliding doors as well as an additional protection in the form of a guillotine door, which would actually drop down like the name implies and provide an additional seal against the water. But there were a few issues. In the day-to-day operation of the ferry, it was found that actually using the guillotine door was impractical and slowed down the whole operation, so it was rarely, if ever, used. But more critically, if the door was damaged at all, it couldn't drop down. And it just so happened that on that January day, the guillotine door was damaged and unable to be lowered. Then massive waves began to burst through the stern doors, and the crew couldn't shut them. With water pouring in and unable to drain, and with no watertight compartments to stop it, the ship began to take on a list to her side, but her captain did his best to change course and keep the stern out of the worst of the waves. With the list worsening and a rescue mission actually struggling to find the ship, it became clear that Princess Victoria did not have long to live. The lifeboat, Sir Samuel Kelly, bravely battled its way through the heaving seas and actually managed to carefully rescue as many as it could before the ferry completely sank and took 153 passengers and crew with her, leaving only 44 survivors. Now, a subsequent inquiry found that the doors had not been designed with enough strength, and they couldn't hope to stand up to the kind of heavy sea one might expect to encounter between Stranraer and Larne. To add insult to injury, though, the scuppers, which were essentially drains intended to carry out any accumulated water in the car decks and dump it over the side, were found to be totally ineffective. So obviously, Princess Victoria was a ship with a few design faults, but surely fitting a heavier duty set of doors would remedy the issue. Well, years later, in 1994, another Ro-Ro ferry very famously met disaster, all thanks to the design of its doors. The Swedish-Estonian ferry Estonia was a decently sized thing, about 15,600 gross tons, and around 515 or 157 metres long. She could carry 2,000 passengers and no fewer than 460 cars between Tallinn in Estonia and Stockholm, Sweden. Now, on September 27, 1994, the ferry set off for Sweden, but encountered heavy seas, up to 20 feet or 6 metres tall, and a wind speed equivalent to a force 10. She battled her way forward for hours, pitching and rolling in the massive waves, when at around 1 AM there was a loud bang that reverberated through the ship. A quick inspection from the crew showed no issues. Warning lamps did not sound, and all seemed well. Except the banging sounds continued, and then, just 15 minutes later, Estonia began to roll onto her starboard side. Now, clearly something was terribly wrong, and the general emergency alarm was sounded, but things happened too quickly for the ferry and her passengers and crew. Just 50 minutes after the first sign of trouble, Estonia was gone, and she had taken around 850 of her human complement with her. Now, this is actually ranked as one of the worst peacetime shipping disasters in modern history, and immediately the cargo doors were an obvious suspect. Unlike the Princess Victoria, by this point, Ro-Ro ferries were being built with bow-loading doors where the ship's forward end would essentially open up like a giant mouth and passengers could drive right in. It made loading and unloading even faster, but obviously those doors had to be able to withstand a huge amount of force, because at the bow of the ship, they would need to bear the brunt of all the ocean's might. It's not an engineering impossibility, but it's difficult to pull off with certainty, and it just so happens that Estonia's doors featured a design fault. The bolts which actually secured the doors to the hull had failed under the strain, and then the complex ramp structure behind it was dislodged in such a way that the alarms weren't rung, and the bridge had no idea that the door was now technically open. Forging ahead, more and more seawater was forced into the hole, and then the vehicle deck. Being the middle of the night, the deck was uninhabited at the time, no warning was sounded, and it was flooding with tons and tons of water. The result was a free surface effect, where all that unchecked water would unbalance the ship, and it resulted in Estonia rolling completely onto her side. Remarkably, Estonia's bow visor, or door, the entire forwardmost section of the ship, was recovered intact, and the inquiry established that, incredibly, the visor was not considered crucial to the ship's safety. It was the inner bow ramp's failure afterwards which had allowed the water to enter. Ro-Ro ferries are unique in that in order to actually operate, they really need this design Achilles heel, a massive loading port in the forward or rearmost part of the ship so that cars can get in. And coupled with that uncomfortable fact was the added design quirk where most other ships feature the complex watertight compartments to prevent ships from flooding if they do start taking on water, but the Ro-Ro ferries needed to have that contiguous deck free of bulkheads or obstacles so that cars could actually get in and around in the first place. All the success and safety fell down to the design and safe operation of the doors. It all comes down to how well engineered and strong those doors are in order to actually keep water out and keep the ship's hull watertight at all times. Lessons were taken away, and the concept of the Ro-Ro ferry had been refined so that they are very safe indeed. But human error can still creep in, and no matter how well designed your ship is, people can and will find a way of messing things up occasionally. So it was in 1987 that the Ro-Ro ferry, Herald of Free Enterprise, was departing on a routine voyage from Dover to Zeebrugge in Belgium when the ship began to take on an enormous amount of water. Within less than half an hour of departure, and with about 550 people on board, the ferry capsized in just 90 seconds. It killed 193 people, and the cause of the disaster was frustratingly simple. Those huge, safe bow loading doors were simply never shut. The crew, under pressure from constant operations and tight schedules, had failed to ensure the doors were closed, and the skipper put his ship to sea simply assuming that they had been. The inquiry called the mishandling of the ship a, quote, disease of sloppiness, and incredibly, earlier calls for alarms or indicators actually reporting the position of the doors were ignored. Battlecruisers and Ro-Ro ferries have very little in common, save for this. Their reasons for being were designed around very specific functions that made design sacrifices in order to actually succeed. Now, that by itself is not necessarily a problem, so long as the ship was used for what it was purely intended for. Britain's battlecruisers were not meant to go head-to-head with battleship caliber guns. It's likely that the barbette armour was their Achilles heel in that regard. And similarly, Ro-Ro ferries of the 20th century relied entirely on the strength and integrity of their loading bay doors. A single failure in any part of those systems could have catastrophic results. It's surely testament to human engineering today that thousands of Ro-Ro ferries operate safely around the world, and the might of the ocean is held back by the clever design of the loading doors. Ships like ocean liners and warships are obviously designed to fulfill a specific purpose, and their intended role actually impacts the design of the ship, its actual structure, way more than you'd expect. Take, for example, rolling. A passenger ship needs to be designed to maximize passenger comfort, so shipbuilders actually need to decide just how they want their ship to roll, and then they can adjust this by designing the ship's metacentric height. Too large, and the ship will snap back and forth in the waves, flinging crockery from tables and resulting in a miserable experience. They're too small, and the ship will roll slowly and seem to not want to come back. It's a surefire way to trigger seasickness in most. Complex math has to be done, and engineers try to strike a happy balance between the two. Down below, the ship's power plant is also crucial. Different ships need to go at different speeds, and some of the fastest of their time were ocean liners. But shipbuilders didn't always get it right. The Asturias and the Alcantara were two new proposed sister ships for the vaunted Royal Mail line that were supposed to carry the company into a new age, but a misstep in their engine design would see them become an embarrassment and relegated to the history books. Ocean liners needed to go fast. It's what they existed for in the first place, to get people across the world's oceans as quickly as possible. It wasn't just for passengers' comfort either, it all had to do with profitability and good business. A company in the 1910s would have needed 3 or 4 medium-sized ocean liners to maintain a regular weekly crossing schedule across the Atlantic, but that many ships incur a lot of running and maintenance costs. By the 1920s and 30s, you could replace the 4 with just 2 larger, faster ships. If the ships were bigger, they could fit more people, and it would create more profit. So speed for ocean liners was absolutely paramount, and that guided the way that they were designed and built. Shipping companies would commission the ship to be built by a shipyard, but crucially only a small amount of money changed hands at the start. It was up to the shipyard to finance building the ship, and then to demonstrate that the ship could achieve the speeds and performance that the owners needed it to. and only then would it change hands and be paid for by the new owners. And so it was in 1925 that the RMS Asturias was on her sea trials to demonstrate her speed, when all on board were bitterly disappointed that the ship's top speed was way slower than ships that were 10 years older. It all had to do with attempted innovation and more than a little bravado. See, back in 1924, the head of the Royal Mail Line was Lord Kilsant, and he was also the chairman of Harland and Wolff, the shipbuilders in Belfast. And I've actually covered Lord Kilsant on this channel before. He's the cheeky devil who ran the White Star Line into the ground and racked up over $1 billion in today's money worth of debt. His baby was the Royal Mail Line, a company with a vast fleet of ships. But in the First World War, the company lost many of its vessels, which was of course a devastating blow. They had got back on their feet by rebuilding cargo ships first, but then in the mid-1920s they were ready to replace their prestigious passenger ships that had been lost in the war. And one of the more lucrative routes for the Royal Mail Line was in South America, where the ships would call at Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina before heading back to Southampton, England. Now, as always, speed was the critical factor. A pair of fast, large, and modern sister ships would increase profitability for the company, and here is where Kilsant was presented with a choice. What kinds of engines should the shipyard install? Steam engines had been used for decades. It was the propulsion system that actually birthed the Oceanliner in the first place, but by the time of the First World War, an innovative new kind of engine had arrived that today we're all familiar with, but which back then was a radical departure. In the late 1800s, a German engineer was making an engine that ran by compressing air and mixing in liquid fuel to create combustion, and his name was Rudolf Diesel. Now, the diesel engine, you may have heard of it before. Back in the day, it was a huge deal for a number of reasons. In land-based vehicles, it got rid of the need for spark plugs. The diesel engines on ships were an even bigger deal because they could do away with bulky coal. Coal was a nightmare to work with. Refueling took literal days, and it required the installation of massive boilers fed by hundreds of men to burn the coal and create steam for the engines. Diesel engines installed on ships could draw fuel oil from tanks and ignite it in the engine itself. It would mean there would be no need for boilers, no hundreds of stokers, and no days-long refueling process. Nowadays, the technology has been perfected, and diesel engines are the standard at sea. But back in 1924, when Lord Kilsant was plotting out the two new Royal Mail ships, it was like uncharted territory. He needed Asturias and Alcantara to do 20 knots exactly. The speed would keep them on time and profitable. Now, he could choose to fit steam turbine engines, but these were expensive and they took up a lot of space. They were standard for the era, and they would be for many more years to come, but the ship's bottom levels would be totally occupied by the massive amount of necessary boilers. To run in reverse as well, the turbines needed complicated and delicate gearboxes. If Kilsant chose to use a diesel motor setup, the massive cavernous space that would otherwise be used for boilers could instead house cargo, and the diesel engines could run in reverse at the drop of a hat. As head of both Royal Mail Line and the ship's builders Harland and Wolff, he had the final say, and he decided to go for it. It would give him and his company bragging rights to suggest that they were leading the technological charge. The diesel motors would be built under license at the shipyard and would be, at the time, the largest yet built. Now crucially, this wasn't Harland and Wolff's first dalliance with diesel engines and ships. In 1920, the company had built the cargo vessel Glenap and fitted her with two diesel engines. Now these motors were enormous, standing the height of a 2-story building, but despite their size, they were surprisingly underpowered. They could only generate 4,500 brake horsepower. It meant that Glenap could only amble along at 12.5 knots. Now by 1924, maybe Kilsant thought the technology had been refined, and Asturias' engines would be far more powerful. The diesel engines were installed with 8 massive cylinders each, and both capable of about 10,000 indicated horsepower, making Asturias the most powerful motor ship in the world. With 20,000 horses pushing them through the water, Kilsant must have thought that Asturias and her subsequent sister ship would easily hit their 20-knot speed target. That's 23 miles per hour, or about 37 kilometers per hour, by the way. In 1926, the ship was completed and ready for her sea trials. The motors were worked up, and the ship roared through the water at cruising speed, 16.5 knots. She could go faster, but it would mean that the engines would be at full throttle the entire time, burning fuel and money. Even then, she couldn't hit 20 knots. Now, if Royal Mail Line was a normal customer, they would have flat out rejected the ship then and there, and Harland and Wolff would need to either cover the cost of re-engineering or come up with some kind of clever solution. But as it was, there was only one person to blame. Lord Kilsand. He had chaired both companies, and he had decided on the engines. The pair of sisters Royal Mail Line desperately needed to service one of their most competitive and lucrative routes were a pair of white elephants. In fact, their French competitors, Compagnie de Navigation Sud-Atlantique, had a pair of ships on the route that could easily hit 20 knots and beat Asturias and Alcantara to Buenos Aires by days. But the most embarrassing thing about this was that one of the French ships, the Lutetia, was over a decade older than Asturias, which was then Britain's newest liner, and one which had been heavily marketed and proudly proclaimed to be the most powerful motor ship in the world. It would take a few more years yet for diesel engines to be perfected, but it seems that in 1925, Kilsand had jumped the gun. By 1931, Lord Kilsand was in jail. Now, I've covered why in my video about the cancelled super ocean liner that White Star Line was planning called the Oceanic. It's well worth a look, because it's a wild story. But the gist of it is that he was jailed for fraudulent activity, and Asturias and Alcantara were having their butts kicked on the South Atlantic route by German and French competitors. Royal Mail Line, now under new leadership, began to float the idea of replacing the ship's engines to get them up to speed. They gave the task to Harland and Wolff on the condition that the yard could put in new machines that would get the ships up to at least over 18 knots. Now, the yard agreed and got to work, but they knew that for every knot slower than that speed, they would need to have to pay out a penalty. They ripped out the underperforming diesels and put in 6 powerful turbines instead, as well as boilers generating superheated steam. The result was a 25% increase in power, and the two ships could at least hit just under 20 knots. They remained in service up until the 1950s, but the failure of their original designs was just another blight on Kilsand's career. As a curious footnote, in 1957, Asturias was awaiting scrapping at Faslane in Scotland when a film production crew asked for permission to use her for a movie. They repainted part of the hull, and Asturias played the role of Titanic in scenes where the ship's boats are being lowered for the movie A Night to Remember, which is all the more fitting because both ships were even built at the same shipyard. Now, Asturias and Alcantara are an interesting case study because although their engines were underpowered, the designs of the ship's hull and interiors were sound, so all they needed was to be re-engined. But some design errors are actually way more serious because they're built into the ship's very structure, its skeleton, its steel. This can result in some quirky behavior at best, but at worst, it can lead to the deaths of many, many people. Take, for example, the German ocean liner Imperator. She was intended to be a response to British superliners like Mauretania and Olympic. The mastermind behind the ship, Hamburg America Line's brilliant Albert Barlin, intended for the ship to be the first in a trio designed to absolutely outdo the British in every way. In itself, it's a fascinating story, and we've also done a video on that too. I'll put a link in the description. But in 1906, the biggest ship that Germany had ever built was the SS Kaiserin Augusta Victoria at about 24,000 gross registered tons, but Imperator would be twice that size. Now, building a ship that big is a huge learning curve that the German shipyard Vulkanwerke was happy to take on. The design called for an immense ship with 3 towering smokestacks and ornate interiors that were modelled on some of the most famous hotels in the world, specifically the Ritz. In 1913, Imperator set out on her sea trials, and her builders and owners must have been extremely proud because they'd achieved their goal. Imperator's interiors certainly put the newest British liners to shame, but there was a huge problem. The designers had messed up somewhere along the way because Imperator didn't seem to want to stay on an even keel. The ship's desire to list over to one side has become legendary. Passengers on some of the earlier voyages were so dismayed, they gave her the nickname L'Imperator. Now, the ship's hull was huge and towering, and the smokestacks on top stood the height of a 5-story building. It meant that the ship's centre of gravity was just way too high. Urgent calculations must have been done by the builders because they figured that she was safe enough to operate, but that she would exhibit some quirky habits, namely responding to any rubber inputs by lazing over to about 5 degrees and staying there. She wasn't at risk of capsizing, but the ship was clearly unstable. It would need to be rectified, but it was too late. The much publicised maiden voyage was coming up. Imperator set to sea. It's actually hard to find a bit of footage or a photograph that shows the ship on an even keel. This, coupled with electrical failures and fires, resulted in Hamburg America Line pulling Imperator from service just 1 season into her career for a full refit. Now, they did everything they could to fix the issues. First, the funnels were cut down in height by as much as 3 meters, or almost 10 feet. And then 2,000 tons of cement was poured into the ship's double bottom to act as ballast. Passenger cabins were attacked as well. Marble bathtubs were ripped out, and they were replaced with cast iron ones, which were actually lighter. Decorative panels made out of marmor, a kind of marble, were replaced with plaster, and then heavy wooden furniture was ripped out and replaced with cane. In 1914, Hamburg America Line held their breath as the new and improved Imperator entered service, but then they were dismayed to find that the changes had done relatively little to help. In the 1920s, the ship's new owners Cunard Line had a go at solving the problems too, but even they couldn't do it. The simple issue of her centre of gravity was so ingrained in the vessel's bones that it couldn't be overcome with simple fixes. Honestly, in my opinion, to solve it, probably an entire upper deck at least would have needed to have been taken off. In the end, the ship had a successful career, but a quirky lean to one side has become the stuff of legends. Imperator's design fault led to behaviour that was just that, quirky. If it was that dangerous, I can't imagine that Hamburg America Line, or even their builders, would have allowed the Imperator to go to sea in the first place. But sometimes design faults can slip through the cracks that are much more serious, even though they might seem, at first glance, glaringly obvious. In 1906, a pair of sister ships were introduced that were celebrated for their modernity and their luxury, but which actually harboured a deadly secret that would result in the deaths of over 1,000 people. In the early 1900s, the Canadian Pacific Railway Company wanted to up the standards of its transatlantic fleet. The company ran a fleet of running mate steamships between Liverpool and Quebec, but they were simple, utilitarian passenger cargo vessels that put just as much emphasis on the cargo as they did the passenger. Canadian Pacific's dream was to build a celebrated pair of liners to bring standards of luxury to that route that had previously only been seen on board the most celebrated liners of the day, which sailed on the prestigious service to New York. The result was a pair of ships built at the famous Fairfield shipyard in Govan, Scotland, Empress of Britain and Empress of Ireland. The two ships were of medium size, about 14,000 odd gross registered tons, but what they lacked in size they made up for in modernity. The ships featured electric lights throughout, and modern fixtures like flushing toilets and call buttons. Passenger spaces were lush and comfortable. They brought a whole new standard of luxury to the route, and in that regard, Canadian Pacific Line absolutely nailed their brief. The lounges, cafes, ornate stairwells, and smoking rooms were a huge hit when the ships were first introduced, but what Canadian Pacific Line was most proud of was the modernity and safety of the two ships, because they'd done everything in their power to up the standards of safety at sea as well. In the decades leading up to the introduction of the Empress sisters, a series of maritime disasters had guided shipbuilders in how to protect their ships. The most obvious takeaway was the need for a double bottom, and then compartmentalization. Now, a double bottom was like an inner skin on the ship's lowest point that would protect it from damage from below. The second skin would trap water and prevent it from flooding into the ship, but the hull could still be damaged from the side. So to stop water from flooding freely throughout the ship, the hull was split into sections called compartments, which were separated by watertight bulkheads, tall steel walls rising up from the bottom of the ship that could be sealed off by watertight doors. Now, if the hull was damaged in one spot, the flooding would be contained to that one compartment. In later years, the watertight doors could be closed electronically from the bridge, but in the Empress of Ireland's day, it was still largely a manual process. So the crew were trained and drilled in the event of an emergency to take heavy brass keys and then manually hand crank the 24 watertight doors shut. In practice tests, this could be done in less than 3 minutes, which is fairly impressive. Now, the Empress of Ireland and her sister ship featured 10 bulkheads that rose through the hull as high as the shelter deck, creating 11 compartments. Now, Board of Trade regulations had stipulated since 1890 that ships longer than 425 feet in length be designed to remain afloat with any 2 adjacent compartments flooded. Now, we'll call this factor floodability. That's the amount of compartments that could be flooded without the ship being lost. Floodability relied on a few things, mainly that the flooded compartments remain watertight. This posed a problem for designers and builders. People, passengers and crew alike needed to walk through the ship along its length to be able to get around, so bulkheads rising up from the bottom of the ship can then intrude on passenger spaces, making navigating very difficult. It also adds more doors for the crew to close in an emergency, so for reasons like this, back in the day, watertight bulkheads did not rise to the top of the hull but only as high as some of the lower passenger decks. Now, this would prove suitable for most situations because it would mean that the water just couldn't spill over the top and keep flooding the ship, so long as the doors were shut. Now, this is all common knowledge now thanks to the Titanic disaster. That ship was designed to stay afloat with 3 or 4 compartments breached, but in the event, more were flooded, creating a cascading domino effect that sank the ship. On the Empress sisters, the compartments had to be designed to make sure that if any 2 adjacent compartments were flooded, the margin of buoyancy would not be exceeded and the ship wouldn't sink. If 2 compartments were made too big, for example, then in an emergency, their combined volume would pull the ship down and sink it, because the ship would be made far less buoyant. And here is where the Empress's designers made their first misstep, because 2 of their compartments were far, far too big. It was the engine and boiler room compartments that were the largest of their kind because of the size of the machinery they had to house. In the dead centre of the ship was a pair of cavernous boiler compartments, separated by a single, tall, watertight bulkhead and a series of large coal bunkers. Now the compartments were huge. They were 87 feet, or 26.5 metres long, compared to the forward compartments, which were about half that length. If open to the ocean and flooded, the Empress of Ireland should still have been able to stay afloat, providing the watertight doors were closed. But then, only barely, because the compartments were so voluminous. If they were flooded, it would come dangerously close to exceeding the margin of buoyancy, and the ship would sink. There was absolutely no margin for error. With those 2 compartments flooded, the Empress could take on absolutely no more water whatsoever, or she'd sink like a rock. Now her designers knew this. Unfortunately, it was a necessary evil to make those compartments so big purely because of the size of her boilers. Now to compensate for this, they came up with what they thought was an ingenious solution. They could take the compartments and then subdivide them even more into something like mini compartments that would slow, or maybe even stop, the spread of flooding water. They couldn't do it across the width of the ship because the crew would still need to be able to get around through the boiler room as easily as they worked, so instead they could do it down the ship's length, adding things called longitudinal bulkheads that split one half of both boiler rooms essentially into 2. In the empty space, they added storage for coal. It meant that if a boiler room was breached, only half of it would flood. Simple. And besides, the odds of a ship being hit dead center like that must have seemed extremely low. With the job well done, the ships were built and introduced, and they served well for the better part of a decade. But then in 1914, the worst case scenario played out, and the Empress's Achilles heel was revealed. In a dense fog, the Empress of Ireland was rammed dead center by the coal-carrying ship Storstad, and honestly, it's almost as if the disaster had been designed as a kind of engineering experiment, because the Empress was hit in exactly the worst possible spot. At least 15 to 20 feet of Storstad's bow, which by the way was designed and heavily reinforced specifically for ice breaking, plunged deep into the Empress, creating a gash which stood stories tall. Suddenly, the celebrated safety measures which had been put in by her builders were put to the test, but there was an immediate series of problems. See, when Titanic had hit its iceberg 2 years earlier, something like 12 square feet of the hull was opened up, allowing water to slowly come in and fill the ship over about 2 hours. But the Empress of Ireland was opened up to the river right between her 2 boiler rooms, with a hole allowing 60,000 gallons of river water, that's 250,000 litres, to enter the ship every second. Now the stewards rushed to their posts to shut the doors and make the compartments watertight, but they were immediately overwhelmed. Stewards in third class were met with a tidal wave of river water that drowned them all on the starboard side of the ship, and the doors remained open. In the boilers, the stokers didn't even have a chance at closing the doors. They did their best just to run out of the way. So now the 2 largest compartments were open to the St. Lawrence River and flooding incredibly quickly. The Empress's margin of buoyancy would be exceeded, and she would sink. But the designers had foreseen this. Remember, the Empress's boiler rooms had those longitudinal bulkheads designed to split the massive compartments into 2 and keep flooding restricted only to one side. This choice would have devastating consequences for passengers and crew, because as soon as she began to flood, the water's flow was hampered by the longitudinal bulkheads, meaning that the starboard side of the ship had taken on tons and tons of water that the port side didn't. The ship leant over in the water so severely that the lifeboats on the port side of the ship were useless as they soared higher and higher in the air and they swung inwards. Worse still, on the inside, passengers struggled against the lean as they tried to escape desperately through stairways and spaces that were now almost impossible to climb out of. With only one side of the boiler compartments fully flooded, and the water flooding unimpeded into other compartments, the Empress wallowed in the water, until finally the inevitable happened. With the starboard side of the ship settling lower and lower into the water, now portholes which were open on that side began to allow water in too. The ship's centre of gravity was met, then exceeded, and then she rolled over, dramatically, not fully capsizing, but coming to rest on her side. In the end, some 1,012 people died as a result of the Empress of Ireland's sinking. The ship was always going to sink. That blow from the Storstad was an absolute killer, and there was nothing the poor stewards and crew could do to shut the watertight doors. But in the event the ship had been built without the longitudinal bulkheads, the boiler rooms would probably have flooded evenly and bought the ship a little bit more time. She would have begun to sink on a fairly even keel, enabling people to escape, lifeboats on both sides of the ship to be swung out and lowered. It would have saved dozens more lives at least. If the ship had been sailing through the fog with her watertight doors shut as a preventative measure in the first place, she wouldn't have sunk at all. Nowadays, ships at sea have their most critical watertight doors shut by default. It makes it more difficult to get around, but it means that in the event of an emergency, the most important compartments will already be made watertight and the flooding will be contained. Now this was actually put to the test in the 1990s when a cruise ship almost sank. In 1998, the Monarch of the Seas grazed a reef off St. Martin's, which opened up a monumental gash in the ship's hull, about 130 feet or 40 metres long and 6 foot 7 or 2 metres wide. Now the ship began to immediately take on water and sink down by the head, so the captain grounded her on a sandy shallows and evacuated the passengers. Now a subsequent report found that an incredible amount of the ship had been opened to the ocean, with 3 whole watertight compartments breached and flooded, and 16 tanks and spaces in the double bottom flooded as well. But SOLAS, the body responsible for maritime safety, found that the ship would have been able to stay afloat if she hadn't been beached anyway, because the ship still had plenty of reserve buoyancy, and the flooding had been contained because the watertight doors were shut. Now unfortunately, safety lessons usually come at the cost of human lives, and in the case of longitudinal bulkheads that run along the ship's centerline, it was found after the Empress of Ireland's loss that they had actually contributed to the loss of life. A centerline subdivision was dangerous. It split massive compartments into 2, but meant that the ship would lean dangerously over in the water if flooded. Instead, machinery spaces could be split safely into 3 or 4 with longitudinal bulkheads because it meant that if one was flooded, it wouldn't be a big enough space to make the ship list. As tragic as stories like this are, their continuing legacy today is the improvement of safety standards, and lessons learned the hard way in the past are continuing to help save lives today. In 1939, the Royal Navy was outfitting its newest class of destroyer when it became clear that something was badly wrong. The ship was leaning to and fro at its fitting out wharf, and it hadn't even reached the open ocean yet. At sea, it would probably completely capsize and roll over. There was a serious issue that had gone surprisingly unnoticed during the design phase, and it would have dramatic consequences. In the late 1930s, the British Admiralty was preparing for an impending war with Germany because at the time, it seemed like an inescapable likelihood. If a war broke out, the burden of defending Britain's coasts and trade would fall to the world-famous Royal Navy, so much effort was put into upgrading warships and phasing out older types wherever possible. By the late 1930s, the Admiralty had realised it needed 2 completely different kinds of destroyers. These handy warships were like a Swiss Army knife. They were capable of doing many different tasks, but some would need to be specialised to accomplish specific roles. The Royal Navy needed destroyers for fleet work, that is, serving alongside warships to engage enemy fleets in open ocean. They prioritised speed and a heavy torpedo armament. But by contrast, the Navy also needed modern escort destroyers. These were smaller and easily mass-manufactured. The escort destroyers would protect the slow, vulnerable merchant convoys from enemy U-boats and surface warships, as well as aircraft. In the First World War, this type of warship was called a sloop, and not a destroyer, because a sloop is not designed for big fleet deployments, but simple convoy escort work. They were typically slow, no faster than 20 knots, when most fleet destroyers could steam along at 30 or more, but they were cheap and they were useful. In late 1938, a design specification was issued for a new type of fast escort ship to help out with convoy duties. They had to be about 1,000 tons, achieve speeds of about 30 knots, and be kitted out with a powerful anti-aircraft armament. Crucially though, they also needed to be easily mass-manufactured and cheap to produce. Rather than start from scratch, and with the outbreak of war looming dangerously close, the Admiralty design team, under the naval architect Sir Stanley Goodall, took the recently introduced HMS Bittern, an escort sloop, and decided to base their design off of that. The plan was to use Bittern as a basis and upsize her to create a new, larger, and more powerful class of convoy escort warship. If that were all the design team had to accomplish, it wouldn't necessarily be a problem, but as always, bureaucracy crept in. The new class of ship would be expected to lend a hand in fleet actions as well, if necessary, meaning they would also need to be fast. The design team got to work. The new ships would be called the Hunt class. First, Bittern's design was slightly lengthened from about 266 feet to 278 feet, and her beam was narrowed from 37 feet to 28 feet 10 inches. A greater length and narrower width, or beam, would make the ship faster through the water. On top of this, the draft, which is the amount of ship below the waterline, was reduced from 8 foot 5 inches to about 7 foot 9 inches. Now hopefully, this is ringing some alarm bells for you already, because surprisingly, apparently it didn't do so for the design team. When equipped with powerful Parsons turbines outputting some 19,000 shaft horsepower, the Hunts should have been able to achieve speeds close to about 30 knots. As part of their escort duties, the Hunts would need to protect from German aircraft. They would need a heavy anti-air defense armament and seakeeping behavior that would make it easier to aim the guns. The first part of that equation was easy enough. For main armament, the Hunt class copied HMS Bittern. They would mount 3 turrets, each with a pair of 4-inch dual-purpose guns, for a total of 6 guns. Now the Hunt class had their anti-air armament, the designers went to work ensuring they could aim them easier. A ship's designer can actually influence just how much the ship rolls in the water. We've looked at this on the channel before. It has to do with the ship's metacentric height. For a ship designed to engage aircraft like the Hunt class was, a long, slow roll would be better than a quick, snappy one. If the ship was rolling slower, and more predictably, it would make the guns easier to aim, so the Hunt class needed a low metacentric height. This was calculated with complex mathematics by the design team, and checked by Sir Stanley himself. But off the bat, Sir Stanley had his reservations. In his daily diary, he wrote that he felt that the design team was, quote, poor, and they might need more supervision, but in the rush to rearm and upgrade the Royal Navy in the face of a war, Goodall's remit was completely overloaded with projects that all required his attention and sign-off. Unfortunately, it meant that several obvious signs that the Hunt class would be a disaster went unnoticed all the way from the drawing board to construction. Upsizing a ship's design, like that of the Bittern class sloop, is actually quite difficult because it means all the careful calculations that were made to ensure the stability and good seakeeping need to be done and done again. The first Hunt-class ship, HMS Atherstone, went down the slipway in December 1939 and was completed, ready for duties in March 1940, but tests showed some alarming behaviours. Before even putting to sea, at the fitting out wharf, it was found that Atherstone was dangerously unstable, which was a serious problem because the first 20 Hunt-class ships were already ordered and under construction, nearing completion. Atherstone, with her anti-air turrets mounted high up, seemed likely to capsize in anything more than a moderate sea. Something had gone terribly wrong. The complex mathematics required to calculate the ship's centre of buoyancy and its rolling motion had taken the design team some time to calculate, but somewhere, somebody had made a mistake in their math. Basing the Hunt's design on the Bittern-class sloop meant concessions would need to be made, and in the quest for more speed, it should have already been setting off alarm bells that the Hunt class would be required to mount a heavy defensive armament high up on the superstructure, while also being significantly narrower than the Bittern class. Early on, Sir Stanley had actually caught wind of this issue, and he figured that the beam would need to be increased. Before Atherstone, the first Hunt-class ship, was laid down, the beam was increased by 9 inches. But clearly it wasn't enough. To account for the additional heavy guns and the need for a specific metacentric height to provide a stable platform, lots of calculations were done around the predicted vertical centre of gravity. In fact, so much mathematics were done for these ships that each new design ended up with its own class book of calculations. This was full of formulas and information that was checked and signed off by Sir Stanley Goodall, but it seems like he, the design team, and even a second independent calculator brought in to check the figures missed a simple error. In calculating the predicted centre of gravity, a figure of 7 feet was given from the keel to the upper deck instead of the actual 17 feet. This meant that a huge amount of weight was omitted from the equation from low down in the ship. Thinking they had more to play with, the designers essentially stacked more weight up on top and didn't realise they were too light down at the bottom of the ship. The independent checker should have caught this, but they didn't. Instead, they just copied the figures, the final numbers lined up, the calculations looked right, and the design was approved. A year and a bit later, the Hunt-class ships lolled in the water pathetically without even going to sea. So with a dud series of ships, the Admiralty design team got back to the drawing board. Clearly, not much could be done for the 20 or so Hunt-class ships that were already completed or underway. For these ships, known as Batch 1, one of the 3 4-inch gun turrets was removed, the funnel's height was cut down, and some of the superstructure around the bridge was removed, giving the ships a leaner silhouette. No less than 50 tons of cement were poured in to the bottom to provide additional ballast and weigh down the ship below. Now, that would do for the first lot, but it was far from ideal. The ships had needed to carry a full battery of 6 guns, not just 4. The Admiralty design team caught their error. The Hunt-class's beam was increased from a mere 28 foot 3 inches to 32 foot 6 inches. The simple change to the ship's width ensured all 6 guns could be fitted as intended. In the end, 86 Hunt-class ships were built. They did a fine job during the war, but the inglorious start to their career was an avoidable embarrassment. It can probably be chalked up to an overworked team rushing to get a design through as quickly as possible, with the best of intentions, and then a senior overseer like Sir Stanley who was just as overworked and preoccupied. But while Britain was preparing to face the might of the German Navy, it turns out that the Germans were making some design blunders of their own. If there's one thing that can be said for German warships, it's that they are extremely pretty with their long, sleek silhouettes. But it was exactly this quality that early on meant that some of Germany's battleships functioned almost more like submarines than surface ships. In the early to mid-1930s, Germany was hurriedly rearming its navy, pouring hundreds of millions of marks into replacing the grand fleet it had lost following the First World War. The resultant surface warships actually took a lot of internal design cues from First World War ships as far as armour layout and things like that, but essentially they were designed for close-range engagements in the Atlantic and North Sea, and especially for hunting down Allied merchant ships and convoys. Early on, the surface warships were given relatively small caliber main guns. The famous pocket battleships like Admiral Scheer were designed as a kind of heavy cruiser, but in 1935, Nazi Germany committed to building proper battleships with the sisters Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. These were formidable modern fast battleships that mounted 9 28cm or 11-inch guns, a small caliber as far as battleships go, but one ideal for picking apart merchant ships. The real secret to their success was their speed, an impressive 30 to 31 knots, thanks in part to the immensely powerful triple steam turbines outputting some 160,000 shaft horsepower, but the speed was derived from that power plant coupled to the hull shape. The battleships were long and narrow, a hull form ideal for cutting through the water like a hot knife through butter. It would make the pair a deadly duo, able to engage and disengage the enemy at will, attack a convoy with impunity before escaping quickly into a developing rain squall if the resistance proved too dangerous. They would be quick. Another feature of the ship's design to enhance their speed was the bow shape, a straight stem. The stem is the very front of the ship and it gives the bow its shape. In the glory days of the Oceanliner, back in the late 18 and early 1900s, designers had toyed with a variety of shapes for their stems in the ever-growing quest for speed. Cunard Line introduced Mauretania and Lusitania in 1907 with very straight stems. A straight stem differs significantly from a raked stem, which introduces an angle to the bow. An angled or raked stem essentially provides more bow structure, meaning there is more buoyancy, simply more ship to float. It means that a ship with a raked bow is more likely to ride over the waves comfortably, as the raked stem and bow is lifted by the ocean. But a straight stem, by contrast, has less buoyancy. It means the ship will cut straight through a wave and maintain its speed. Lusitania and Mauretania, with their straight stems, could easily cut through massive Atlantic swells and maintain their fast, record-breaking crossing times, but they also exhibited some strange behaviours. One of my favourite stories is from the Mauretania. The straight stem gave the ship a weird tendency to drop suddenly underfoot, something that occasionally startled passengers. Once, her captain, dressed up to the nines for dinner, went quickly to the bridge to check that all was well before heading below, when suddenly, in the face of a big wave, Mauritania's bow dropped, and the wave rolled up the bow, crashing over the bridge wing, dousing the captain completely in seawater. Designers back then used to account for this loss of buoyancy forward with an emphasised shear, that is, an exaggerated angle on the ship's deck. As the bow narrows, the shear line flicks up dramatically, providing, once again, simply more ship's structure to float and prevent any unwanted dropping by the head. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were each designed with straight stems to emphasise their speed. In fact, most of those early Nazi German surface warships were, including the pocket battleships and even the modern heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau went for their sea trials, and they sure were fast, but then their bows started dropping into the sea. The straight stem meant that there just wasn't enough buoyancy for the ship to ride over waves, which, to be fair, is exactly what the designers had wanted. They wanted their ships to cut through the waves instead. But with such low, sleek hull forms, there was barely any freeboard, that is to say, barely any ship above the waterline to begin with. Lusitania and Mauritania had tall hulls. It meant that they could deal with the heavy seas, even with a straight, narrow bow. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were the opposite, and even worse, they had relatively little shear to account for it. They shipped tons and tons of water over the bow when the sea was up, and waves were bigger. With the forward decks awash, the seawater found its way through ventilation ducts and hatches to flood the inner workings of the bow and cause short circuits in wiring around the first gun turret. Now, this was obviously not okay, and it became pretty obvious that some serious modifications were needed. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were both held up while their bow section was redesigned. The old, straight stem was cut away, and a new raked shape was added instead. The anchors, which had sat in hawse pipes on the side of the hull, were moved to sit up on deck because, with decks awash, they were likely to be ripped away. The new bow came to be known as the Atlantic bow, and it turned out that Scharnhorst and Gneisenau weren't the only ships that actually needed them. The surviving pocket battleships like Admiral Scheer had their bows replaced, so did the brand new heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper. Then the famous Bismarck, newly launched, was given one too, but her sister ship, Tirpitz, didn't have a completed hull yet, so she was actually launched with the new raked bow installed. For Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the fix didn't totally remedy the issues, but it did enough to prevent serious flooding. Now they rode the waves a little easier instead of sinking under them, but it was still common in heavy seas for the ships to travel with their forward gun turrets traversed to point backwards to prevent damage to the gun barrels from any unusually large waves. The fact was, they had such little freeboard and such a shallow shear line, they would be doomed to ship water over their bows for the rest of their careers. To be fair, this problem wasn't unique to the German battleships. Other warships from the time, including Allied surface vessels, became known as wet ships for doing the same thing. But for the Germans, the issue was serious enough as to require a full redesign and refit for most of their big surface warships. Lastly, here's a short one for you, and it has to do with Titanic, but not in the way that you might think. We all know about the ship's design shortcomings, we've actually covered them in exhaustive detail on this channel before, but one stands out because, on the night of the sinking, it caused some proper confusion. Titanic was the second in a trio of sister ships, the first being RMS Olympic. The ship took a number of design cues from older White Star liners, and clearly one of the great Edwardian pastimes at sea was walking. Early White Star Line ships featured lots of lovely long promenades for people to get fresh air and stretch their legs. On Olympic, the designers gave first class no more than 3 massive promenades. The first was up on the exposed boat deck at the top of the ship, then below that was the open promenade on A deck that ran the length of the superstructure, and then below that could be found a fully enclosed promenade space to protect passengers from the elements, with natural light coming through from big square windows that could all be hand-cranked open. Now, early on it became clear that this was just too much. Passengers enjoyed having some enclosed promenade space, but 3 dedicated promenades was just too much and a huge waste of space. The designers fixed this on Titanic, deleting the B-deck promenade almost entirely and installing new and insanely luxurious suites and staterooms in its place. Up on A-deck though, they did something interesting. They provided first-class passengers a kind of half and half experience, with the forward section of the promenade being enclosed with a screen and windows, the same that were used on Olympic's B-deck promenade, and the aft section was left open. It gave Titanic's exterior a unique look, and it solved the problem well. except that there was one huge issue that was completely overlooked. See, the promenade deck wasn't just a space for passengers to stretch their legs, it was also meant to play a crucial part in the ship's evacuation during a potential disaster. Olympic and Titanic's evacuation plan called for passengers to meet on the promenade deck on A deck to wait to get into the lifeboats. The boats were stored up above on the boat deck. With passengers waiting below and out of the way in an orderly fashion, it would give the crew enough space to ready the boats and swing them out. The boats would be brought to the level of the open promenade on A deck, and passengers could step up on a small stool, climbing out through the railing and into the boat. Easy enough. But on the night of April 14th and the morning of the 15th, this plan was actually put into action and found severely wanting. After his ship had hit the iceberg, Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats be readied, swung out and lowered down to A deck, as was standard practice. He had been captain of Olympic before that and had done such lifeboat drill on that ship. The crew got to work and passengers waited down on A deck, but those early boats encountered an issue. Smith had forgotten that Titanic had one whole half of its promenade deck enclosed. It meant that passengers couldn't get through. The windows had to be hand cranked down. Lifeboat 4 on the port side was actually lowered down to A deck before they realised the windows were closed and couldn't be opened without the handles. Somebody was sent to fetch some, and then the crew moved on to lowering other lifeboats. Lifeboat 4 was left swinging there empty for most of the evacuation until finally a member of the crew had got a handle and managed to crank some of the windows down. The passengers were fed awkwardly through the open windows into the boat, and it was lowered away a full hour after it had been swung out in the first place, at 1:50 AM, only 25 minutes before the ship was gone for good. It is only a minor design error. In the end, most of the boats were boarded from the boat deck and it wasn't a big deal, but it seems incredible that it should have been overlooked in the first place, so it needs to go down in history as one of the great maritime design fails.